So I'm going to introduce Bliss Broyard, who many of you may know, who's going to be our moderator today. She's the author of the best-selling story collection, My Father Dancing, which was on the New York Times notable book list, and her award-winning memoir, One Drop, My Father's Hidden Life, A Story of Race and Family Secrets, which I remember so vividly as an incredible book. About her personal journey of discovery after learning that her father, Anatole Broyard, the charismatic literary critic, had his whole life concealed his black identity from his children. Chicago Tribune named One Drop as the best book of the year and finalist for the Essence Literary Prize. And Bliss has contributed to numerous publications, the New York Times, Elle, New Yorker, Condé Nast, and as I said, many of you know her from spending her childhood summers here. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear okay? No? Okay. How's that? Better?
Better.
Okay, great. And I'm going to welcome Heather McGhee. So Heather McGhee designs and promotes solutions to inequality in America. Through her work at Demos, the progressive think and do tank, she drafted legislation, testified before Congress, and developed strategies to improve the lives of millions. She currently chairs the Board of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. Heather has garnered over 1 million views of her TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone, and 8 million views for her conversation with Gary, a white man from North Carolina who called into a live C-SPAN interview with Heather to tell her that he was prejudiced and he wanted to change. So her new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Cost Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, lays bare the huge economic and psychic toll of racism on our country and its people. As Ibram X. Kendi said, this is the book I've been waiting for. Indeed, it's an amazing synthesis of data, policy analysis, history, storytelling, and heart. In fact, I was moved to tears, which I was not expecting reading what I thought was going to be a really smart policy book. This is Heather's first in-person event, or one of them, for some of us, and we're so glad to have her. Please join me in welcoming her. So we're also really lucky because she's offered to start us off with a reading from the book.
Yes, which I haven't. One of the joys of this in-person thing. I feel like a real author. My book is in my hands. There are people that I'm looking at. Some of whom are holding the book and have read the book. It feels really tremendous, and I'm so happy to be doing it here on Martha's Vineyard. I went to Milton Academy for high school from the south side of Chicago. It's where I met my husband, Kasim Shepard, who's in the audience. And I spent the summer after we graduated from high school living in a little house on County Road and working at Mad Martha's by the ferry. So it's really great to be back here, really great. And I can't believe I haven't had any ice cream the whole weekend that I've been here, but you bet I'll be doing it right after this. So I am going to read from, just very briefly, from chapter 2, which is called Racism Drained the Pool. Okay. Effective January 1st, 1959, the Montgomery Parks Department would be no more. The city council decided to drain the pool rather than share it with their black neighbors. Of course, the decision meant that white families lost a public resource as well. It was miserable, Mrs. Moore told a reporter 5 decades later. Uncomprehending white children cried as the city contractors poured dirt into the pool, paved it over, and seeded it with grass that was green by the time summer came along again. To defy desegregation, Montgomery would go on to close every single public park and padlock the doors of the community center. It even sold off the animals in the zoo. The entire public park system would stay closed for over a decade, and even after it reopened, they never rebuilt the pool. I went to see Oak Park for myself in 2019 and walked the grounds looking for signs of what used to be. I was able to spot the now barren rock formation where the zoo's monkeys used to climb. I asked the friendly women in the park's office where the pool had been, but nobody was quite sure. Oak Park used to be the central gathering place in town for white Montgomery. On that hot afternoon, I was one of only 4 or 5 people there. Groundskeepers outnumbered visitors. I noticed an elderly white couple sitting in a car in the parking lot. They saw me approaching and stared without welcome. I stood for a beat, smiling at the car window, before the man reluctantly rolled it down. "Hi, sir, ma'am," I ventured, getting nods in return. They appeared to be in their 80s. "Are you from around here?" More nods. "I'm doing a project, and I was wondering if you remember where there used to be a big pool here?" The couple looked at each other, still wary. "Yes, of course," the man replied curtly. "Do you remember where it was?" They hesitated, and then the woman pointed straight ahead to where they'd been looking moments before. I took a sharp breath of excitement. Had I interrupted them reminiscing about the pool? Maybe they'd met there as teenagers. I leaned forward to ask more, but the man recoiled and rolled up his window. I backed off. Where the woman had pointed was a wide, level expanse rimmed with remembering old oak trees. The only sounds were the trilling of birds and the far-off thrum of a lawnmower.
Right, beautiful. So tell us what brought you to that pool, and also the history of these grand public pools in the United States.
So in the 1930s and 40s, the country went on a building boom of public amenities, public parks and schools and roads and bridges, libraries, and pools. And these weren't any kind of pools. These were grand resort-style pools that could hold thousands of swimmers at a time. It's kind of hard for me to even really picture them. And there used to be nearly 2,000 of these kinds of big public swimming pools. And they were part of a larger government ethos that really was born out of the lessons of the first Gilded Age. We're now in the second. Out of the crucible of the Great Depression, it was part of this New Deal spirit of the country that said, you know what, the government has a role and a responsibility in ensuring a decent standard of living for our people. And it was really expressed in this massive building boom of public goods. And of course, you know, I come at this history as an economic policy person. And so for me, that public goods ethos, the more significant iterations of it were Social Security and a massive investment in affordable housing and things like the GI Bill and all of this, public goods that really successfully created the greatest middle class the world had ever seen, that really ensured the highest standard of living in the world by the 1950s, was here in the place where we invented this thing called the American dream. And yet, virtually everything I just described was, in one form or another, racially exclusionary. Whether it was explicitly whites only, like the massive investment in housing, where the country, at the same time as it committed to housing that workers could afford, drew maps of the entire nation and drew lines around the black neighborhoods and told private lenders, do not lend in these areas. Or subsidized massive investments in housing developments, really guaranteed private developers investments in creating housing, and yet required, the federal government did, racially exclusionary covenants so that the units could only be sold to people wholly of the Caucasian race. Or it was the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, but was filtered the public benefits through segregated housing and education sectors. And so many eligible black returning GIs were actually unable to access the benefits. So throughout, and I go through this in the book, there's sort of this list of free stuff that the government did to create middle class prosperity, and it was exclusionary. And so often were the pools, whether it was like Montgomery, where there was, literally whites only, or it was in places in the West and Midwest and North where there was no sign, but everybody knew, and it was enforced through intimidation and violence that we could not possibly mix at this public pool. And so once desegregation came, once black families sort of empowered by the civil rights movement said, those are our tax dollars that have been funding those public goods too. We want, in the case of the pool, our kids to swim too. Many towns across the country drained their public pools, like Montgomery, Alabama did, in the wake of the threat of integration. And, I visited the one in Montgomery, but the story is not just a Southern story. And I think it's really important to recognize that. It happened in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio, in Missouri, in St. Louis, very famously, a massive pool, probably the biggest one in the country, maybe even in the world, because this was sort of like our thing, big American public swimming pools, happened in Washington State. And for me, the drained pool really began to, in the journey that I took to write The Sum of Us, stand in as an analogy for what happened to that broader social contract of public goods that ensured high wages, high taxes, high investment. People joke often now, if we had to build the Hoover Dam and put a man on the moon now, we never would, right? We don't do those kinds of big public things together. And I really wanted to know why, because I had spent a career in economic policy trying to address inequality and seeing this resistance to public investment. And ultimately, I think a big piece of what it comes down to is an ambivalence among the majority of white voters to the idea of sharing goods with a public that they've been taught are not good, right? That they've been taught to disdain and distrust. And that's really where you saw a massive shift along the fulcrum of the civil rights movement of white support for government, white support for the Democratic Party. Right after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, he would become the last Democrat to win the majority of the white vote to this day, and really a shift away from the formula that had actually created the white middle class. And that's why I talk about how racism ultimately has a cost for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was so fascinating to me about the pools, which I didn't realize, is that part of the point was to help create a kind of white identity out of a disparate white population of Italians. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is very fascinating, right? This question of how do you create a sense of being one people, a sense of community, a sense of the commons? How do you have people fall in love with each other and, get to know each other's kids? It really is those public spaces, right? And so it's the public schools, it's the public pools, and policymakers, city planners, county officials were very clear about that. They really wanted to create these public goods, public libraries. You'd have shared sources of knowledge to deal with what at that time was, a massive explosion in demographic change, right? We don't think of demographic diversity that way now because all of those European immigrants ultimately became white. But for a time, there was a sense of, in the 10s and 20s, we've got to create a melting pot. We've got to forge some new American identity, and we need our physical spaces and our economic policy sort of levers to enable that. And that's really what the swimming pools, in many instances, in the broader sense of public goods were.
And so, obviously, if, when they filled the public pools, then kids couldn't swim unless their families could afford to join a country club or build a pool in their own backyard. Right. So not only black kids, lost out, but white kids too, whose families couldn't. So it was a loss for everyone.
That's right. That's right. And it was a shift from something that used to be free and a public good to something that was a private cost or a private luxury. And I talk about drained pool politics impacting the cost of college, which the government used to pick up the tab for, state colleges. 8 out of every $10 was public money. And so it enabled working class kids to go to college, work in the summer and graduate debt free. And then over the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as the college going population became more diverse, we saw the draining of the pool of resources, cutbacks at the state and federal level, the shift from grants to loans. And so now we have this largely privatized system of even public colleges where most of the money comes from tuition in most states. And of course that's created this student loan bubble, which is, harming our ability for the next generation to build assets and start new businesses. And ultimately for me, that is another cost of racism in our politics and our policymaking having a cost for everyone.
Yeah. And when you looked at sort of what was behind this drained pool policy, you came up with a zero-sum mentality.
Yeah.
So zero-sum mentality meaning more for this person, less for me. That we're in this place of scarcity, and there's only so much to go around. And of course, that played out in a very racialized theater.
Yes.
Generally, Black people were viewed as the takers, welfare queens, and white people are viewed as the providers, or either through taxes or their benevolence. But it was so fascinating to me that you trace the zero-sum mentality as really part of the United States origins. Can you talk a little bit about how long we've lived with this, and why the zero-sum mentality was created in the first place?
Yeah, so the zero sum was described in a whole body of sociological research. That was one of the first things I really dug into when I made the decision to leave my job running a think tank and take this journey across the country and really kind of wrestle deeply with this question of why we can't have nice things and why we keep allowing inequality to grow. And so when I first came upon the studies that talked about the zero sum, it was very much in the context of, the 2010s and the late decade of the 2010s. And yet one of the things I promised myself in my research was that I sort of wouldn't take anything for granted. I would remember that everything we believe comes from a story that we've been told. And I would ask sort of who's telling the story? Why? Where did the story come from? Let's not just sort of naturalize the idea that we're in this head-to-head competition and all human beings are tribal and all of that, right? There's a way in which you can sort of say, well, yeah, that's just a natural way that humans think. But I thought, the research is showing that zero-sum worldview is actually more predominant among white Americans than it is among Americans of color. And it's less predominant in other societies that are somewhat similar to ours. So why this story? Why do we believe it? Where did it come from? And so there I had to do a sort of historical research to look at the sort of narratives and the policies in our early days, and how this zero-sum story really was sold by the colonial plantation elite at our sort of to justify our first economic model in this country. Because of course we know that the economic model that was adopted required a massive amount of stolen people and stolen labor and stolen land, and yet there were Europeans who came who were not part of the plantation colonial elite. They were not the owners and the wealthy. They were indentured servants and people who were in this sort of, after their servitude, kind of messy, landless, jobless middle in an economy that actually didn't need or want their labor. And that was very threatening, right? You don't actually want a bunch of dissatisfied people running around when you are at the top of a very unequal pyramid. And so I talk about the history of Bacon's Rebellion, for example, which was one of many cross-racial servant uprisings, which actually successfully overthrew the colonial government in Virginia for a time. And the response to that threat, that all the people who were toiling would come together across color and overthrow the elite, was to create these color distinctions. To say, actually, you Christians, because that's how they were conceived of, because we hadn't yet formulated this sort of skin color taxonomy, you Christians are with us, the plantation elite said. You will have certain privileges that these black-skinned people, these heathens, will not. These black and brown-skinned people and red-skinned people, these heathens will not. So side with your color instead of your class. And in exchange, you'll get these privileges, but what you have to then do is become the enforcers of the racial hierarchy. And so you really began to see that what we think of as racism, like this belief in a hierarchy of human value, was created to justify greed. And so for me, that has been the kind of interesting tension throughout our history, is how does racism ultimately serve the purposes of greed? And can you really disentangle racism from greed? Not on an individual bias level, but I'm talking about systemic racism. And when the tool of racism is used to kind of plow the field of mass exploitation, then you end up having a society that is dysfunctional and self-sabotaging. And so the book goes through all these different examples of it.
Right, and even it's on the institutional level, but then it gets on an individual level too, where people buy into this mentality. And I thought that your example of Medicaid expansion in Texas, where I didn't know this, but that Medicaid, I mean, there really is no reason not to do Medicaid expansion when you look at it. It really doesn't cost the state hardly anything, but that so many people, voters in Texas, were against it because they thought that they were going to be seen as the takers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I in the drained pool story, the cost of college is one, but then healthcare is another, right? And for me, it seems like healthcare is actually where we never filled the pool of public goods in the first place. We never had a universal system, even though it was proposed in the 1940s by Harry Truman. But his proposal was for it to be a national universal health benefit, and that would be non-discriminatory. He was sort of really the first pro-civil rights president since Lincoln in many ways, or since the Civil War. And he proposed that, and the Southern Democrats in his own party, who were the segregationist Dixiecrat caucus, basically said, hell no. And we lost that first attempt at universal health care. And even what we have now, which of course was created by President Obama and the Democrats in 2009, happy birthday, President Obama, has really fallen along racial lines in terms of support, right? Even though white Americans are the largest share of the uninsured, still to this day, the majority of white people are not supportive of the Affordable Care Act, as modest as it is, right? As sort of pro-market as it is. And in Texas, we see, and there are about 10 other states that are in this camp, that once John Roberts sort of stealthily both preserved parts of the Affordable Care Act, as of course it should have been preserved, but also struck down the 50-state Medicaid expansion. The idea that people, basically working class folks who were making too little to be able to buy individual health care on the market and who were likely to work for employers that didn't care to give them health care were sort of stuck, right? And if you're making $15,000, $17,000, $18,000 a year, how do you buy a health insurance package? And so the idea was we should do it publicly, and that actually would create jobs, make healthier workers and families, all of these benefits. And yet, by using a states' rights legal theory, which is what John Roberts did, said it's actually up to the states to decide whether or not their people have the human right of health care. He created this sort of new Mason-Dixon line of health care where a lot of former Confederate states, plus Maine, refused, their legislatures refused to expand Medicaid. And it is a huge federal benefit for the state's economy. So in Texas, I talk about how they've lost all of these rural hospitals because they have all of these uninsured people and they don't have the Medicaid money, and how important rural health care is to the economic vitality of the community.
We're
right?
seeing, of course, right now. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I always think of Ronald Reagan's statement about the 9 most terrifying words in the English language is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And I wonder, maybe some of you remember that, 1986. So it's funny because reading your book, of course I knew about, the FHA loans and the VA loans and GI Bill, but I didn't necessarily think of it as government assistance. Because government assistance now has sort of taken on, I think, somewhat of a negative connotation, but of course, as you pointed out, that our American middle class, was built through through the government assistance. And I just wonder, it feels like that there's sort of 2 ways to approach it, that you can get white people to see how they've been benefited from government assistance, and that's how a lot of people have created wealth in this country, but also sort of destigmatize government assistance. And I wondered if we were entering with this kind of COVID care packages and now the infrastructure bill, if you see a tide changing at all about people seeing the role of government and being able to help.
It's such a good question. I finished writing the book in November, and so many things have happened since then that are really relevant. And one of them has been, in many ways, a real shift in Washington to being willing to refill the pool of public goods. Right now, as we sit here, the United States poverty rate is the lowest it's been in recorded history. And that's not something that's, very well known. I'm not sure that everybody from your faces, I'm not sure that everybody here knew that. But it's because the pandemic created the permission, this sense that we needed to have a massive government response, and it included stimulus checks, fixing the unemployment insurance so that you didn't have to be a full-time W-2 worker, which should have happened anyway because we've got 40 to 50% of people, depending on how you're counting, getting their money from contract work, right? And that doesn't mean they're not working, and that doesn't mean they can't lose those jobs, but it meant that they were ineligible for unemployment insurance, expanded food stamps, which also helps farmers, and now the child tax credit, which was also a fix of should have been a tax rebate that went to families with children, but because of the policy design didn't actually go to most families who needed it. The combination of those supports has dropped child poverty by 84%.
Wow.
It's extraordinary, right?
Yeah. And that can have generations of impact.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what does that mean, right? That means so much for those families. It means so much for those school districts and communities. I mean, it really means that we are taking care of our people and not allowing, one of the wealthiest countries on earth to have one of the highest child poverty rates on earth, which we have had for most of our history. Yeah. So I do see a shift. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to stay. Right, the child tax credit as one example, right? It's up to $300 per child per month, and no strings attached tax refund that basically says, it's expensive to raise a child. You need help. We trust parents to know what to do with it. That fix to it and that expansion of it is only eligible for 1 year. It's only been expanded for 1 year. So there's going to be a fight to make it something that can help parents and families into the future and can keep child poverty numbers low. The racialized sort of language around welfare and the idea, basically, that comes from this zero-sum mentality, this sense that if you help your neighbor, somehow that's taking from you, somehow that's not a good investment, right? Somehow that won't actually ultimately make for a better, healthier, more educated population that is great for employers and great for the future of innovation. It's great for our democracy, right? There's this sort of sense that we're not all on the same team. That's largely racialized, but it's not always, it's not exclusively racialized. That's what I think we really need to fight in order to become a country that is sort of worthy of its people.
Yeah. Well, I think I saw a lot of those politics play out where I live in New York City, and with the school situation, because there's this idea that there's a scarcity of quality schools. And so you have middle-class people so focused and fighting over what they perceive as the few good choices, that it sort of feels like this vicious cycle. That we create this zero-sum mentality, and then it reinforces that there's not a lot of choices, and then people are so distracted and kind of focused on getting it for themselves that they don't think about the greater good. And of course, if we can't succeed, as we saw with COVID, if, some people over here are totally suffering.
That's right.
And I wonder, just to go to the question of deservedness, and this idea of, like, who really deserves the rights of of citizenship, and who deserves the American dream, and who really belongs, which you really dig into in the book. And I wonder if you could speak a little to that. That's a big subject.
I think this is where the individual views, sort of the individual work that folks are often doing around anti-racism and sort of noticing the stereotypes in our own minds and noticing the narratives in media that project those stereotypes, that's where that links up with the structural, right? Because the structural is about laws and policies, what the minimum wage is, if you get health care, school funding, things like that. And then there's the individual of, what do I think when I see someone of a different race, right? But the way that those meet is when we are talking about the sort of storycraft of politics and how if is apparently the case according to, the research that I found. The majority of white moderates and conservatives believing that Black people take more from society than we give, then that helps to substantiate a policy that is punitive towards Black people, right? And so where does that story come from? Our history is not that old, right? I'm very lucky to have had great-grandparents on both sides of my family, well into my early adulthood and sort of late teenage years, who both passed away over 100. It's not that long, right? It is not, we have not had that many years since when it was economically essential for a narrow elite to communicate broadly that Black people were so lazy that we had to be forced to work, right? That's the story that justified the economic practice. Right. And it was a lie. It's a lie today. And yet when you still see those ideas, those negative stereotypes, they're still doing work, right? They were justifying slavery before. They're justifying meager public investments, which then justify low taxes, right? They're still doing work. And so that's when it comes to the question for me that seems of paramount importance, which is who is telling this story? Who's selling it? How are they profiting from it? Why do we still have this story? Who is promulgating it? And then it becomes very clear when you start to look at our media landscape and look at our political rhetoric that this kind of very mean narrative about our fellow Americans, whether they're, families that are poor and struggling, or they're Black or brown, or they're trans, or whatever it is, right? Whatever the identity that is currently being sort of picked on and scapegoated, there's a purpose there. And it's not just because, there's often this fight, does this political leader, does he have a racist bone in his body? Has he ever dated a Black woman? Has he ever, we go down to this sort of silly, individualistic, moralistic thing, and it's not that, it's useful. It's useful to divide us up. It's useful to have us not have empathy and solidarity for one another, because then we don't have the public will and strength to wrest the resources that we need to invest in all of us.
Get a union organized. We've got so many great examples, and I was glad to see one of the solutions, and we will talk quickly about solutions. We're not going to leave you feeling so depressed about the state of the country, but was integration, that when people on both the policy level, when policies come together to benefit all, they're stronger, better policies, but also just on the individual level, there's a lot of great research in the book about when people, for example, there was two groups of people that you write about that had to solve a murder mystery, and one was a group of all white people, and one was a diverse group, and in all instances, the diverse group solved the murder mystery faster, because people, when they're with people that don't necessarily think like them, perform better. And so I think you have some takeaways for us.
Oh, yeah. I was going to read a little part.
And then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, great. So I'll just say that before I read this is from the conclusion called The Solidarity Dividend. I started writing this book in 2017. I'd been working on economic policy, trying to advance policies to promote inequality, solutions to inequality for nearly 20 years. And it felt like the inequality era was just growing, and that the concentration of wealth and power and the sort of economic insecurity of working and middle-class people was growing. It felt very hopeless. And the journey that I took to write this book made me much more hopeful. And I am a hopeful person because, and this book made me realize even more so than I knew, that policies and public decisions have created the world that we live in now. And so better public decisions can get us out of it. And so it really does make me hopeful. So this is 5 discoveries. My journey from across the U.S., from California to Mississippi to Maine, tallying the costs of racism, has led me to 5 discoveries about how we can prosper together. The first is that we have reached the productive and moral limit of the zero-sum economic model that was crafted in the cradle of the United States. We have no choice but to start aiming for a solidarity dividend. That's what I call the idea of these gains that we can unlock, but only by coming together across lines of difference. The second is that the quickest way to get there is to refill the pool of public goods for everyone. When our nation had generous public benefits and investments, they were the springboard for a thriving middle class, but they were narrowly designed to serve white and soon-to-be white Americans. Third, because of that, our people are not all standing at the same depths today. So we must resist the temptation to use universal instruments to attain universal ends. When it comes to designing solutions, one size has never fit all. Everywhere that I found white people paying the spillover costs of racism, I also found that, without exception, their coworkers and neighbors of color were paying even more in lost wealth, health, and often lives. Getting white support to address those different levels of need and to acknowledge the racism that caused those differences is never easy, particularly when the zero-sum mental model turns every concession into a threat of loss. That's why, uprooting the zero sum is essential, as is embedding in its place the value that I found radiating out of the people who had the biggest impact on me and their communities, the knowledge that we truly do need each other. The fifth and final discovery, I think I lost it, that was third, fourth, here we go, damn. The fifth and final discovery is that we've got to get on the same page before we can turn it. We've tried a do-it-yourself approach to writing the racial narrative about America, but the forces selling denial, ignorance, and projection have succeeded in robbing us of our own shared history, both the pain and the resilience. It's time to tell the truth, with a nationwide process that enrolls all of us in setting the facts straight so that we can move forward with a new story together.
Great. All right. Thank you. So if you have a question, you can step up to the mic. Anyone would like to ask a question? We got somebody, brave soul.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. Fascinating discussion. I wanted to know, Heather, you talk a lot about the social contract between governments and society.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing more of a discussion around the social contract between corporations and society, especially the last year and a half.
Yeah.
You know, performative engagement, the black boxes that we saw, but people are really calling for a more meaningful contract, ranging from climate issues to social issues. I'm wondering, do you actually see us evolving to the point where we are having a social contract, both with government and corporations with society? And if so, what are the opportunities and the risks there?
Oh, thank you. What a good question. I tell a story in the book, this kind of imagined story that was the way I sort of internalized what I learned in economics about sort of how we came to that social contract, the era of shared prosperity, where it was really about government, individuals, and corporations being part of that shared contract, right? Whether it was much higher rates of corporate contribution to the public purse, right? It used to be over 30% of our federal revenue came from corporations. Now it's less, about 7%. Or it was a sense that the CEOs were creating, value and goods that needed to be shared on a fundamental level with their workers, which I think really began to break down around this same time in the early 1970s. And of course, the link of executive pay to shareholder compensation, really changed the incentives there. But it really was about a government business individual or government business sort of citizen social contract. And I think sort of every part of that has been torn up. Nonetheless, one of the places of real vanguard social activism, really over the past 20 years, has been in the arena of demanding that corporations, now that they have this really outsized role in our democracy, now that there's less, in some areas, regulation and antitrust and certainly collective bargaining, there's sort of fewer ways for the public to enforce to dictate what corporations do or to guide or have standards and safeguards. There's this strange kind of wish and hope that corporations will sort of be better citizens. And, it doesn't have a lot of teeth, and for those who were here for Senator Klobuchar's conversation, I think there's, a lot to carry through from that. I do think that we have to both hope and press upon corporate actors to recognize that they live under the same sky as the rest of us, right? That they are drinking water, they are sending their children to school, that ultimately this is about the society we want to live in, the planet that has its planetary limits. But ultimately, and I say this as the chair of the board of an organization, Color of Change, that does a lot of corporate campaigning, a lot of corporate advocacy. It's about laws, regulations, standards, safeguards, norms, right? Ultimately, we can't let capitalism write the rules for our democracy, right? Democracy has to write the rules for capitalism. And so I think it's useful to have corporations saying and doing the right things, particularly to sort of, in moments of, as we are now, of creeping fascism and authoritarianism, where we really need sort of the gatekeepers to say, I'm not usually on one side, but here's where the line is. That's important, but that is only important as part of an ecosystem that ultimately leads to the public deciding what the rules are, and our government saying that this is what we are going to be allowed to do in society in order to ensure that it exists and democracy exists for the next generation.
Oh, great.
You use the term public benefits a lot. And as a person who's been involved in public education for over 40 years, what do you suggest we do to change the narrative about public education and how important and vital it is to this country?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for that question. Public education is really, in the story of the drained public pool, public education is really probably the most vivid example. When it became integrated, all hell broke loose in education, excuse my French, right? And we had the creation of segregation academies, and I didn't realize this before I wrote the book, but as the country started debating, again, having a family policy and universal child care, which we don't have and so desperately need, in early this year, that I learned about the history that when Nixon, of all people, proposed it, it was a lot of segregationists who said, no, we can't have universal child care because that will mean a mixing of the races and the classes, right? So this question of who is in the public really is so essential to the health and vitality and respectability and resources that we give as a population to public education. Obviously, right now, the current attacks on honest education, the fact that 11 states have passed laws to say that public schools and school districts will have financial penalties if they teach about race and racism, is, it's a five-alarm fire, right? It is for me, I think, both an electoral strategy. It's a narrative strategy to sort of distract into this us versus them. It's their history, not your history. You should be worried about your children being sort of indoctrinated and assaulted with the truth in schools. And ultimately, it's a longer-term strategic play to scare white parents away from public education. And therefore, when that happens, we can drain the pool of public education, we can keep taxes low, we can keep our citizens divided and manipulable and lied to, we can rob our country of our shared history, and then, it's open season. And that's really, I think, writing this book really taught me that there's sort of nothing new under the sun, and that same effort to lie to us, to rob us of our shared history, and therefore to be able to manipulate us, it really depends on ignorance. And so I think that we need a campaign for public education. I think we need a campaign for integrated public education. And it's happening, right? It really is happening. And I tell stories in the book
Yeah.
of white parents and white proximate parents who are choosing integrated public education because they're not just going for the test scores. They're not saying what, the other parents are saying at the playground. They're saying, these are my values, and this is what I want for my children and for our community.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Here we go.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I listened carefully to your 5 discoveries at the end, but I think I missed the optimism part. So what is it that makes you think that we as individuals or as a society are ready to make those discoveries and turn the corner?
Great question. Why don't I take the other one just for time, and I will definitely end on yours. I will end on hope.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good idea. Oops. Okay. Oh, I just got to wipe the mic.
Cool.
Yeah, my question is actually related to the last 2 questions, because my lack of optimism comes from almost the chicken and egg nature of it. I'm actually a native Texan. Both sides of my family have been in Texas at least 6 generations pre-Civil War. And when we talk about, well, we want corporations to do better, but, we can't expect them to be moral drivers. However, the apparatus that we as citizens have to impact these changes and make people do better and provide more for our communities are being taken away in places like my home state. My home state has boomed economically over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and a lot of that comes from the diversity and higher education in places like my hometown of Dallas, Houston. As well
Gotta
as
read the book
on
about
the
Dallas.
border, the ranchers and border communities, including the employers, they are very dependent on having a cross-border
Yeah.
economy. And the small number of people who are the loudest voices and control everything coming out of the state are the ones who are undercutting all that and hurting, I think, employers,
Yeah.
as well as individual people. So, but if I, as an individual now, I live here now, but go back home or try, if they're stripping the right to vote of my family back home and my friends, and also saying that the history of my great-great-grandparents can't be taught in schools, how do we enforce change if it's not from the powerful? I see it less waiting for corporations to do better on racial justice, et cetera, and more so, you benefit from this, so you need to help us in
Right.
this. So
Okay.
anyway, that's my
Yes. Thank you
Thank you,
for
Ginger.
sharing. Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we enforce change, and how can we feel optimistic? Or is that-
So we have radically changed our system of governance, our constitutional framework multiple times in the past, right? We are a young country that is figuring it out. That is where I think that so many of the kind of dead hands of the past that are stopping a truly thriving multiracial democracy from making this great nation even better can be removed, right? The filibuster, the electoral college, the Senate, the 50 states, right? We have had various numbers of states, even and odd, right? Throughout our history. There's no reason why we can't have more, right? All of these are within the purview of us. And what the question is are we going to keep losing, I'm just being very blunt here, are we going to keep losing too much of what is still right now the majority population by numbers and certainly by economic and political power out of the fold of people who want to make this country more prosperous and equitable and responsive and make the radical idea of self-governance truly work because of these old beliefs in a hierarchy of human value. Now, part of the reason why I'm optimistic is that we are still in the midst of the largest social demonstration movement in American history. The backlash that you are seeing is a desperate plea by people to stop the mass awakening and consciousness raising that is happening across the country. Our children are right now already living in a country with no dominant racial group, and they are figuring it out, what it means to be an American and who we are to one another. One of the reasons why I'm optimistic is because the book project took me across the country and had me talking to hundreds of people. And so many of their stories are in every page of the book.
Really great.
Oh, thank you.
The stories are so bring it all home.
And I think about, some of the people I met who, as I said just briefly in the part that I read, were the ones who inspired me the most. They're the ones who had, for no reason other than the experiences they had across lines of race, really rejected the zero sum and decided that their own liberation, their own betterment required them to link arms. I think about a woman named Bridget Hughes, who's a lifelong fast food worker, white Irish-American woman, $7.25 an hour, 3 children. Her husband also worked for minimum wage, and there was just, there's no progress there, right? She was a very promising student, but had to not go to college because her family needed her to go to work already, right? And her mother got sick, and she had, because of her culture, her neighborhood, her politics, grown up with this sort of anti-Black, anti-immigrant worldview, this story that she had bought, right, that had been sold by political elites and media elites in her life. And yet, the first time she was asked to go to an organizing meeting for the Fight for 15 an hour, she decided to go, even though she said, they're never going to pay people like us $15 an hour, never, right? She sort of had just believed that there was never going to be more dignity for her work. And she saw a Latina woman stand up and talk about her own life, and she said, I saw myself in her for the first time. And she realized that she could do something to change it for her and for herself. And now she's a leader of the Fight for 15 movement in Kansas City. She tells me things in the book like, it's not about us versus them anymore. It's about we can't come up unless they come up. As long as we're divided, she said, we're conquered. So her transformation, that is one person, but it is absolutely the type of person who is targeted by this zero-sum politics and this drain pool politics. Her realization and willing to fight for a solidarity dividend is what gives me hope.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.